John, I've always focused on the tension between theism and atheism, and scientific training and interested in God and religion. That seemed to be the natural dichotomy. You've asked me to consider something called religious naturalism. Now, to my naive ears, that sounds like a contradiction.
Yes, well, I'm not surprised that you have that reaction. I think you say you're interested in the debate between theism and atheism, but what really interests me is trying to pin down what theism might be. And it turns out that it's actually quite contested. And I think in each of the theistic traditions you find that tension as to how really to understand the nature of God.
Okay.
Now, religious naturalism is a name for concepts which reject the idea that God is to be conceived as a kind of denizen or inhabitant of some other supernatural world apart from the natural universe.
Now, that seems to be the definition of God.
That God should be supernatural.
Yes.
You see, that's exactly what I contest.
Okay.
Now, I think the reason why people might find this a contradiction, religious naturalism a contradiction, is because they would think that what you mean, that if you say that God belongs within the natural world,
Yes, right.
They might think that you're reducing God to an ordinary object, the sort of thing that might be investigated by science, for example.
Right.
And clearly that can't be a concept of God.
Sure.
God, everybody agrees that God isn't one of the things around hereabouts.
Right.
And that God really should not be some kind of mere item or aspect. Right. God has to be the creator of all.
If that's the definition. If God's the creator, you would think there has to be something different about God.
That's right. But you see, I think that if you adopt the normal supernaturalistic view, you haven't gone far enough with that thought. Okay. You've still got God as an item, only you've, I think, invented this supernatural realm in which he operates somewhat anthropomorphically, as a supreme controller of everything, who set it all up in the first place for a good purpose and so on, but is in the end an intentional agent, rather like ourselves, although, of course, unique and uniquely supreme.
Okay.
And I think there is a tradition within theism that you find in classical theism, where not necessarily in the kind of radical views which I am thought of as having, where there is a strong repudiation of the idea that God could be any kind of an item at all. But then you say to yourself, well, that's very strange. If you say God isn't any kind of an item, are you saying that? What do you mean when you say that God exists?
Yes.
And you do find theologians, Paul Tillich, for example, who remark that anyone who says that God exists is an atheist. And at that point, the mind seems to boggle completely. But I hope you can see what I mean by that. That if you're thinking that God exists in the sense in which other things exist, you haven't got a big enough God.
Right. Okay. Right? You've already categorized God by the categories of the way we think about things.
Exactly.
As opposed to moving beyond our own categories. God is beyond categories, so God is beyond existence.
Yes. Now, at this point, if we
sounds like I understand it,
yes,
but I
yes.
really I don't know.
Yes, you do. But at this point, there is a danger that one might just go, as they say, apophatic. Now, perhaps I should explain what I mean by that. Apophatic theology is an approach to understanding the nature of God, which says that the most we can do is say what God is not. And it's out of that, actually, that you get the classical attributes of God. When they say God is atemporal, God is not in time. God is impassible, not the sort of thing that undergoes suffering or any kind of change, immutable. Necessary, that looks positive, but actually it may be apophatic. because it may be saying God isn't a contingent thing that happens to exist now and then later does not.
Right. Or could have not existed.
Yes, and there's also divine simplicity, which is so complicated that I think I'll just leave it. But that gives you the idea. Now, of course, at this point, the atheist could turn around and say, now, wait a minute. Yes, okay, God is not that, and God is not that, and it isn't that. God isn't anything at all. Right. So one does have to, even if you say God is not an item, not even a supernatural item, you have to be able to give an account. So I think you have to be able to give some sort of positive account of what God is.
Okay, so how does religious naturalism do that?
Give that account, right. Well, I think there may be a number of possibilities. One is pantheism, where you say, well, God isn't an item, but God is somehow the whole understood as a unity. And I think it is well worth investigating religious naturalisms of that kind. But that seems to go outside the idea of the monotheistic traditions, for which surely God has to be creator of the whole. Now, what I think is that we may be able to grasp the conception of what it is for God, for the whole to be a creation, a divine creation, not in terms of its having a kind of external supernatural producer, but in terms of its inherently having a certain purpose. In other words, my kind of religious naturalism focuses on the idea that there is a unity to the universe which has to do with its being directed upon a purpose that is supremely good. So that why does the universe exist on this religious naturalist view? It exists for the sake of realizing the good. So does that make any sense to you as a possible theism?
It makes more sense than I thought it would have, because of the way you're using the term naturalism. You're using it as a way of making God even bigger, because if you have God in a supernatural realm, it's sort of the same categories that we already have in the natural realm. So
Indeed.
it looks like you're limiting God, but in fact you're trying to expand God. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And of course, this naturalist conception of God has got rid of the idea of this rather anthropomorphized supreme person.
Right.
And people very often react by saying, well, you've depersonalized God. What has happened to the possibility of a personal relationship with God? But I'm inclined to say, I haven't depersonalized, because that seems to be diminishing, taking the level of personal being and saying God is something below that. I want to say, I would like to say I've transpersonalized God, that there's that our personal existence is something that is obviously very important, but only an image of something even greater. And that's what we find in the nature of God.